The DNC chair, Debbie Do Anything for Hillary Wasserman Schultz, was on MSNBC, otherwise known as the propaganda wing of the Democratic Party, and she was asked whether or not she would be willing to debate her opponent, who is progressive, Tim Canova, and she made an absolute fool of herself. Take a look.
Ask you about your own situation in your own congressional districts. You're being challenged. We mentioned this in the last segment. You're being challenged in your primary this August, Democratic primary. You have a challenger who's a supporter of Bernie Sanders, who's brought in close to $1 million now. Very unusual for a challenger, especially going up against somebody in leadership, to bring in that kind of money. Some of this money, it seems like maybe a lot of it, is coming from Bernie Sanders supporters in small dollars who do not necessarily think you've been a fair arbiter in this primary process. How do you read that kind of opposition you're facing here?
I'm focused on two things. One, continuing to serve my constituents and having the privilege that they've given me the privilege of representing them in our nation's capital to the best of my ability, and making sure that when I run for re-election, as I am right now, I talk about what I've been able to do for them and earning their support once again. And two, making sure that we do everything we can to elect a Democratic president. Those are my professional responsibilities, and that's what I'm focused on.
Your challenger, Tim Canova, is his name. He says he sent you 3 letters asking for debate. He hasn't heard back. He's had supporters, I guess, who've shown up at your events trying to get you to commit to that. Let me ask you here. Will you debate your primary opponent before the August primary?
Steve, I'm focused on the two things that I just said. Making sure that I can represent my constituents to the best of my ability. I'm going to run for re-election and communicate with my constituents about the work that I've been able to do on their behalf, like I always do, and making sure that I can do the best job as the chair of the Democratic National Committee to help us elect a Democratic president.
Let me just ask you again. Let me just ask you again.
I'm here to speak to you as the DNC chair, so I'm happy to talk to you about the presidential campaign, which is why I'm here, and I've answered your questions.
Hold on now. You haven't answered this one question. You're a candidate for re-election. I think it's a legitimate question. Will you debate your opponent in your race for re-election?
Steve, again, I'm going to continue to focus on representing my constituents to the best of my ability, doing the good job that I've been able to do representing them for the last 24 years, and making sure that when I run for re-election, they know the work that I've been able to do in earning their support once again, and making sure that as DNC chair, I help do everything we can to elect a Democratic president. Those are my two responsibilities.
Debbie Wasserman Schultz, Congressman and chair of the Democratic National Committee.
Now, just to clarify, when she says that she's serving her constituents, she's not talking about Florida voters. She's talking about big business. And believe me, she served them very well. She's even willing to team up with Republicans to attack agencies that protect us from big banks and predatory payday lenders. So we should actually change her name to Debbie Do Anything for Big Business Wasserman Schultz, but I think that finally Debbie Do Anything for Hillary Wasserman Schultz is actually starting to gain some traction. So my question is, who does this type of thing? I mean, she behaved herself like a child. So I mean, the only people who actually behave like this are children and politicians, because nobody acts like this. You just repeat the same exact thing like a robot over and over again. He's asking you a question. You can at least have the courtesy to say, look, I don't want to answer this question. Let's move on. But instead, you repeat the same thing like a robot. And look at her behavior. If you look closely at her face, you could just tell how irritated she was. Shut your face, God. I mean, that's the way she was acting. This is a grown woman rolling her eyes on national television. And think about how condescending she was to the pundit. I'm actually here as DNC chair. No, you're on my show. You don't get to dictate the terms. I know that MSNBC is supposed to be the propaganda wing of the Democratic Party, but this is still my show. You don't get to decide what we can and can't talk about. You don't get to decide what you're here as. You're here, and I'm going to ask you questions. Otherwise, I cut your mic and you go. And she even got authoritative with him. She was like, Steve, cut it out. She didn't say cut it out, but did you see the way that she said Steve? I mean, Jesus, how condescending are you?
Steve, again.
Look, I'm going to give you a news flash here. Debbie Do Anything for Hillary Wasserman Schultz. But the world doesn't revolve around you. You don't get to dictate everything. I know that you've tried to rig the process against your opponent by banning his access to Van. I know that you've tried to rig the election for Hillary Clinton by limiting debates, by banning Bernie Sanders from Van. But you don't get to do that. okay? When you do bad things, when you be brazenly corrupt, we get to call you out on it. That's what the media is supposed to be for. And actually, shout out to this pundit because he was actually doing his job. You don't see that very often. He was challenging you. He asked you 3 times, and you couldn't answer the question. It's very simple. Do you want to debate Tim Canova? Well, of course you don't. We know you don't want to debate Tim Canova because you would get owned. See, the only reason why you limit debates or you don't debate Tim Canova is because you're afraid that his ideas will actually resonate with Floridian voters. You're afraid that he actually can beat you. You're afraid that no challenger to an incumbent usually raises this much money. But my viewers, we've all supported Tim Canova. We've donated to his campaign. And even if we unseat you, that doesn't necessarily mean that you will no longer be the DNC chair, but it's a start. And it'll send a message saying that we don't like what you've done with the party. You are responsible for the party losing many seats. As DNC chair, I mean, that's something you take responsibility for. That's your job. You're supposed to get them in office. But under your tenure, Democrats have lost the House, the Senate, and they may lose the White House because you've pushed through Hillary Clinton, even though she's currently being investigated by the FBI, and no, it's not a security review. And yes, Hillary Clinton is the target of that investigation. So in conclusion, Debbie do anything for Hillary Wasserman Schultz. She embarrassed herself here, and this isn't the first time she's embarrassed herself. Now, we've already seen Debbie do anything for Hillary's true colors, but it really manifested itself here explicitly. So it's embarrassing for her, but we all can kind of laugh at it because she's done nothing but try to suppress the progressive revolution. And sorry, we're just tired of your conservative policies, Debbie.
Steve, again.
You don't believe in God, then where's your moral barometer?
Steve.
That's just me talking.
I
You can
understand
believe what
you.
you want to believe,
Yeah.
but if you're an atheist, you're basing your goodness and morality on what?
Steve, again.
All right, here we go.
Steve,
3,
Steve,
2,
Steve, again.
1, go.
Steve, Steve, again.